A billionaire whispers, "You thought you could hide my son?" And the world stops breathing. He came to a small town looking for answers, but instead he found a little boy with his eyes and a woman he never stopped loving. Years of secrets crash down when a single letter from a child changes everything. The billionaire thought his past was buried, but she's been hiding more than just a child. Now the truth threatens to destroy everything he built. A family torn apart by power, shame, and a love that refuses to die. When the world finds out who the boy really is, reputations will fall, hearts will break, and one whispered promise could change their fate forever. Can a man who lost his faith find redemption in the very woman who kept his greatest secret? Or will love be the price they both pay for the truth? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, Grant Whitmore stared at the twinkling city lights below. The crumpled letter trembled in his hands as he read the words again and again. His world, so carefully controlled for the past 5 years, had just been turned upside down. The photograph spoke volumes. There he was, younger and more carefree, his arm wrapped around Lila Carter's shoulders. He remembered that summer day clearly now, the annual staff appreciation picnic at his estate. Lila had worn a simple blue dress, her dark hair caught in the breeze. She'd been different from the other staff members, quiet, dignified, with a gentle smile that lit up her entire face. Grant sank into his leather armchair, his legs suddenly weak. The boy's face floated in his memory. Those familiar eyes, the same determined chin he saw in his own mirror every morning. How had he not seen it immediately? David was the perfect blend of himself and Lila. 7 years. He whispered to the empty room. His fingers traced the edge of the photograph. 7 years ago, Lila had disappeared from his household staff without explanation. He'd been too wrapped up in his wife's illness to investigate properly, trusting his house manager's vague explanation about personal reasons. The memory of David's whispered words in the school hallway echoed in his mind. "Mommy says you're my daddy." Such simple words, yet they carried the weight of years of secrets and unspoken truths. Grant stood abruptly, pacing the polished floors of his penthouse. The space suddenly felt too large, too empty. He'd built his life around order and control, but this changed everything. A son. He had a son he'd never known about. His hand reached for his phone, then stopped. What would he even say? "Hello, Lila, remember me? The man who unknowingly let you go when you were carrying his child?" The thought made him wince. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out, knowing it would be Henry, his chauffeur. The older man had an uncanny sense of timing when Grant needed someone to talk to. Henry stepped into the room, his weathered face concerned. "Sir, you've been up here alone for hours. I thought you might need—" He paused, noting the photograph in Grant's hand. "Ah, you've read the letter then?" Grant's head snapped up. "You knew? About Lila? About—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Henry's eyes held a mixture of sympathy and guilt. "I suspected, sir. Lila confided in me the day she left, but she made me promise not to tell. She was protecting the child, and you, in her own way." "Protecting me?" Grant's voice rose. "By keeping my own son a secret. Sir, if I may." Henry chose his words carefully. "Those were difficult times. Your wife was very ill. The company was under attack from competitors, and the house manager had already decided to dismiss Lila. She didn't want to add to your burdens." Grant sank back into his chair, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "The house manager dismissed her. I never authorized that. Mrs. Henderson took it upon herself." Henry explained. She had traditional views about staff relationships. When she suspected Lila's condition, she gave her an hour to pack her things. The revelation hit Grant like a physical blow. All these years, he'd assumed Lila had chosen to leave. Instead, she'd been forced out, pregnant and alone, by his own staff. "Where has she been all this time?" he asked quietly. "She found work as a teacher's aide at the same elementary school where young David now attends." Henry replied, "She's made a good life for them both, modest but honest." Grant stared at the photograph again, at Lila's bright smile and his own carefree expression. She never asked for anything. No support, no acknowledgement. She just carried on. "That's Lila," Henry said softly. "Proud, but never bitter. She's raised that boy to be just as kind and thoughtful as she is." The memory of David's shy approach in the school hallway took on new meaning. The boy hadn't been scared. He'd been gathering his courage, just like his mother would have done. "I need to see them," Grant said, suddenly standing up. "Tonight. Now." Henry shook his head gently. "Sir, it's nearly 10 o'clock. Young David will be asleep, and Lila— Well, this isn't the sort of conversation to have on someone's doorstep in the middle of the night." Grant wanted to argue, but he knew Henry was right. This required thought, planning, sensitivity. He couldn't just barge into their lives the way the truth had barged into his. "First thing tomorrow, then," he decided. "You know where they live?" "Yes, sir. A small house on Maple Street, about 20 minutes from the school." Grant nodded, his mind already racing ahead. "We'll go after David leaves for school. I need to talk to Lila first, understand everything." He paused, looking at Henry. "Why didn't you tell me? All these years?" The older man's face showed, his inner conflict. "I gave my word, sir. Lila trusted me, and she had so little left to trust in those days. But I've watched over them from a distance, made sure they were safe. It was the least I could do." Grant understood loyalty. It was why he'd kept Henry on when he'd dismissed most of his father's old staff. But this loyalty had protected something precious, his own son. He walked to the windows again, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. The city sprawled below, millions of lives intersecting in countless ways. Somewhere out there, in a modest house on Maple Street, a little boy was probably being tucked into bed by his mother. A little boy who had his eyes and his chin, who had gathered the courage to hand him a letter that would change everything. "Henry," he said quietly, "what kind of man does that make me? That I never knew, never even suspected?" "Sir, you're the same man you were this morning, just one who now knows the truth. What matters is what you do with that truth going forward." Grant turned from the window, squaring his shoulders. Henry was right. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was still unwritten. "I want to know everything," he said. "Everything about their lives, what they've been through. I need to understand before I see them tomorrow." Henry nodded, settling into a chair. As the night deepened outside, he began to tell Grant about the quiet courage of Lila Carter, who had built a life from nothing but determination and love. He spoke of David's first steps, his early words, his gentle nature that so matched his mother's. With each detail, Grant felt the weight of lost years pressing down on him, but also the stirring of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. When Henry finally left him alone, Grant returned to the photograph. He studied Lila's face, remembering her quiet competence, her warm presence in his household. How different might things have been if he'd known, if he'd protected her instead of remaining ignorant in his grief-stricken haze. Tomorrow he would begin to make things right. Tomorrow he would face the consequences of choices made 7 years ago. Tomorrow he would meet his son, not as a stranger in a school hallway, but as a father who finally knew the truth. But for now, in the quiet of his penthouse, Grant Whitmore held a crumpled letter and an old photograph, and let himself feel the full impact of 4 simple words that had changed everything. He is your son. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Grant's penthouse, but he barely noticed its warmth. His usual morning routine felt like going through the motions of someone else's life. The coffee in his expensive thermal mug had gone cold, untouched since his assistant had brought it in an hour ago. His phone buzzed for the 5th time that morning, another board member wanting to discuss quarterly projections. Grant reached over and switched it to silent mode. On his desk, the crumpled letter and photograph lay exactly where he'd left them the night before, like evidence at a crime scene. "Cancel everything," he said when his assistant knocked and entered. "Clear my schedule for the next few days." She blinked in surprise. "But sir, the investor meeting—" "Everything," he repeated firmly, already reaching for his coat. In his private elevator, Grant pulled out his phone and called Marcus, his head of security. "I need you to locate someone. Lila Carter. She worked here 7 years ago, during my brother's—" He paused, the old anger rising. "During that time. The maid who left suddenly?" Marcus asked. "The one connected to the scandal?" "Yes," Grant said tightly. "But she wasn't connected. She was collateral damage. Find her. Now." The drive to his office took 20 minutes through morning traffic. Grant barely registered the familiar landmarks. The coffee shop where he sometimes stopped, the park he never had time to visit. His mind kept returning to David's face in that school hallway, seeing his own features reflected in the boy's. Marcus was waiting in his office, tablet in hand. "I have an address in Colorado, sir. Small town called Pine Ridge. She's been there about 6 years, works as a receptionist at a local medical clinic. The boy is enrolled in Pine Ridge Elementary." Grant studied the information on the tablet. A modest apartment complex on the outskirts of town. School records showing David was a good student, quiet but well-liked. A driver's license photo of Lila from 2 years ago. Her face thinner than he remembered, but her eyes still kind. "Have my plane ready in an hour," he instructed. The flight to Colorado was mercifully short. Grant spent it staring out the window, watching clouds pass beneath him. He thought about his late wife, Margaret, and how Lila had cared for her during those final months. How gentle she'd been, how patient. Had she already known she was carrying his child? Had she looked at Margaret with guilt or just compassion? Pine Ridge was exactly what its name suggested, a small town nestled against the mountains, its streets lined with pine trees now dusted with early snow. Grant had driven himself from the small regional airport, refusing his usual car service. This felt too personal for witnesses. The apartment complex was easy to find, 3 stories of red brick, well-maintained but clearly built decades ago. Grant parked across the street as evening settled in, the streetlights flickering to life. Through a ground-floor window, he could see into Unit 103. His breath caught in his throat. There they were, Lila and David, sitting at a small round table. They were sharing what looked like soup, steam rising from their bowls. David was gesturing animatedly as he talked, and Lila was laughing at whatever story he was telling. Her hair was shorter now, touched with grey at the temples, but her smile was exactly as Grant remembered it. The table they sat at barely had room for their bowls. The kitchen behind them was tiny, with mismatched appliances and what looked like handmade curtains. But there was something warm about it all, something that made Grant's vast penthouse feel suddenly cold and empty in comparison. He watched as Lila got up to clear their bowls. David pulled out what must have been homework, and she sat beside him, helping him with math problems. Their heads bent together, dark hair catching the lamplight. Grant's chest ached at the simple intimacy of it all. Snow began to fall softly, collecting on his windshield. 1 hour turned into 2. He watched as they moved through their evening routine. David taking a bath, Lila reading to him on the worn couch visible through the window. Around 8:30, the lights in what must have been David's room went dark. Grant's memories of Lila during her time in his household played like a slideshow in his mind. How she'd always had fresh flowers in Margaret's room, even in winter. How she'd somehow known exactly when to appear with tea or simply silent company. The way she'd handled Margaret's final days with such grace while he'd been falling apart. She'd disappeared right after the funeral, around the same time his brother's embezzlement scheme had come to light. Grant had been too consumed with grief and rage to question her departure. Now he wondered how many chances he'd had to know the truth if he'd only been paying attention. The snow fell steadily now, creating halos around the streetlights. It was nearly 10 o'clock. Lila moved around the apartment, turning off lights, probably getting ready for bed herself. Grant's fingers were numb on the steering wheel. This wasn't how a man of his position usually operated, sitting in a car like some kind of stalker, afraid to face what waited behind that door. But his usual position, his usual power, meant nothing here. This was about something far more fundamental. Finally, he stepped out into the snowy night. His expensive shoes crunched on the fresh powder as he walked to a door. His heart was pounding as if he'd run miles instead of taking 20 steps. He raised his hand and pressed the doorbell. Inside, he heard movement, then a pause. A light came on in the entryway. He could see Lila's silhouette through the frosted glass panel beside the door, hesitating. The door opened. The door opened slowly, revealing Lila in a faded blue sweater, a dish towel clutched in her trembling hands. Her eyes widened as she recognized Grant, and the towel slipped from her grasp, landing softly at her feet. "Grant," she whispered, his name barely audible over the quiet hum of the heating unit. He stood there, snow collecting on his dark coat, his face a mask of carefully controlled emotion. "We need to talk, Lila, about what David said today, about the letter." Lila's hand flew to her throat, a gesture he remembered from years ago whenever she was nervous. She glanced quickly toward the hallway where David's room lay, then stepped back, wordlessly inviting him in. The living room was small but tidy, with worn furniture that spoke of care rather than luxury. A child's drawings decorated the walls, crayon masterpieces signed in careful block letters. David. Grant's eyes lingered on them, searching for his own features in the self-portraits of stick figures with big smiles. "Please, sit," Lila said, gesturing to the couch. Her voice was steady now, as if she'd been preparing for this moment for years. Perhaps she had been. Grant lowered himself onto the old sofa, noting how the springs creaked beneath his weight. Lila perched on the edge of an armchair across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The distance between them seemed both too vast and not vast enough. "Is it true?" Grant's words cut through the silence like a knife. "What David said, what was in that letter, is he my son?" Lila closed her eyes for a moment, and Grant watched as she took a deep breath. When she opened them again, they were filled with unshed tears. She nodded slowly, the simple gesture changing his world forever. "Yes," she whispered. "David is your son." Grant leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, head bowed as if under a great weight. "How?" he asked, though he knew. He remembered that night, during Margaret's illness, when grief and loneliness had overwhelmed them both. It was during Margaret's last month. Lila began, her voice soft but clear. "Do you remember that night when the doctor said she might not make it until morning? You were so broken, Grant. We both were. I'd been taking care of her for so long, watching her slip away." Grant remembered. The sterile smell of the medical equipment that had invaded his home, The way Margaret's breath had rattled in her chest, the suffocating feeling of helplessness. "You came to the kitchen at 3 a.m, Lila continued. "I was making tea, crying over the honey jar because Margaret had always liked her tea with honey. You were crying, too, the first time I'd ever seen you cry." His throat tightened at the memory. "We held each other," he said roughly, just trying to hold on to something alive in a house that felt like death. Lila nodded, wiping at her eyes with the heel of her hand. It wasn't love exactly. It was comfort. Human comfort when we both needed it desperately. But afterward, "Why didn't you tell me?" Grant's voice rose slightly, and Lila glanced anxiously toward the hallway. He lowered his voice but couldn't keep out the intensity. "When you knew you were pregnant, why didn't you come to me?" Pain flickered across Lila's face. "I tried," she said. "I found out 2 weeks after Margaret's funeral. I was going to tell you that morning, but your father called me to his study first." Grant's jaw clenched. His father, now 5 years in his grave, had been a hard man who valued the family's reputation above all else. "He said he knew about that night," Lila continued, twisting her hands in her lap. "He had security cameras everywhere, even in the kitchen. He called me horrible names, accused me of trying to trap you when you were vulnerable. He said if I ever told you about the baby, he would make sure I lost custody. He had pictures of my teenage brother at parties where there were drugs. He threatened to have him arrested." "And you believed him?" Grant asked, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew how naive they sounded. Of course she had believed his father. Everyone had believed Charles Whitmore when he made threats. He always followed through. "Your father fired me that day, had security escort me out. I was given 10 minutes to pack my things." Lila's voice shook. "I was scared and ashamed and heartbroken. You were drowning in grief for Margaret, dealing with the scandal about your brother's embezzlement. I convinced myself that telling you would only make everything worse." Grant stood abruptly, pacing the small living room. 7 years. He had a 7-year-old son he'd never known about. A boy who had his eyes, his mother's gentle nature. A child who'd been living in this modest apartment while he rattled around in his penthouse, thinking he was alone in the world. "I saw him today," he said, more to himself than to Lila. "Really saw him, and I didn't even know. How could I not know?" A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Both adults turned to see David standing there in Pokemon pajamas, his dark hair mussed from sleep. He rubbed his eyes with small fists, looking uncertain. "Mommy?" he said softly. "I heard voices." Grant stared at his son, taking in every detail. The way he stood with one foot slightly turned in, just like Grant had done at that age. The shape of his nose, definitely from the Whitmore side. But Lila's kindness shone in his face, in the gentle way he looked between them with concern rather than fear. "Go back to bed, son," Grant said, the word feeling foreign yet right on his tongue. "Son," he repeated in a whisper, the simple word hanging in the air between all three of them like a bridge being built one plank at a time. David's eyes widened at the word, darting to his mother for confirmation. Lila nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Is he really my daddy?" David asked, his voice small but clear. Lila held out her arms, and David ran to her, climbing into her lap despite being almost too big for it. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, smoothing his hair. "Mr. Whitmore is your father." "I knew it," David said with the simple confidence of childhood. "You have the same crinkles by your eyes when you smile." He looked at Grant. "But you don't smile very much." The innocent observation hit Grant like a physical blow. How many times had he caught his reflection lately and seen nothing but stern lines and careful control? When was the last time he'd really smiled? "I'd like to smile more," he said carefully, taking a step toward them. If you'll both help me learn how again." David beamed at him. And there it was, Grant's own smile, the one from old photographs before grief and responsibility had hardened him. It felt like looking into a mirror of his past and a window to his future all at once. The snow continued to fall outside, coating Pine Ridge in a blanket of white that made everything look new and clean. Inside the small apartment, 3 people who had been separated by fear and pride and circumstance sat together, starting the slow, careful work of becoming a family. The morning sun painted Pine Ridge's modest streets in soft, golden light as Grant's black luxury sedan pulled up to Lila's apartment building. He had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of David and all the years they'd lost. After checking his reflection one last time, adjusting his casual sweater that still probably cost more than most people's weekly salary, he walked to their door. David answered his knock, already dressed in jeans and a worn but clean Colorado Rockies t-shirt. His eyes lit up when he saw Grant. "Mom, he's here!" Lila appeared behind him, looking tired but composed in simple work clothes. "David, remember what we talked about? Mr. Whitmore, please." Grant interrupted gently. "Just Grant is fine." He turned to David. "Would you like to have breakfast with me? I saw a diner just down the street." "Can I, Mom?" David bounced on his toes, excitement radiating from every movement. "Please." Lila hesitated, then nodded. "Be good, okay? I have to get to work at the hospital cafeteria." The local diner, Pete's Place, was exactly what Grant had seen in movies, but rarely experienced himself. Red vinyl booths, the smell of coffee and bacon, waitresses who called everyone Hon. He watched, fascinated, as David slid into a booth and immediately began arranging the sugar packets by color. Their waitress, her name tag reading Betty, approached with a warm smile. "Well, if it isn't David Carter, your usual chocolate chip pancakes, sweetheart." "Yes, please, Miss Betty." David beamed at her. "This is my—" He glanced uncertainly at Grant. "A friend of the family." Grant supplied smoothly, though the words tasted bitter. "I'll have whatever he's having." As Betty walked away, David pulled a paper napkin from the dispenser and found a pencil in his pocket. While they waited, his small hands moved quickly, sketching what looked like mountains. "That's pretty good," Grant said, leaning closer. "You like to draw?" "Mom says I get it from her side of the family. My Uncle Tommy used to draw comics." David added careful details to the peaks. "These are the mountains we can see from my window. Mom says they're always there, watching over us like angels." Grant felt something twist in his chest. He had the same mountains visible from his penthouse windows, but he'd stopped really seeing them years ago. "Your mother is a wise woman." Betty returned with their pancakes, and Grant watched in amazement as David carefully thanked her, even commenting on her new haircut. The boy had better manners than most of Grant's board members. "Do you like fishing?" David asked suddenly, syrup dripping from his fork. "Mom told me once that my father loved fishing. She said he used to go every weekend before—" He trailed off, pushing a piece of pancake around his plate. Grant's throat tightened. He had loved fishing. It was his escape, his quiet time away from the corporate world. But after Margaret died, he'd stopped going. The last time he'd held a rod was probably around the time David was born. "I do like fishing," he said softly. "Would you like to try it?" David's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? I've never been." An hour later, they stood beside a small pond on the outskirts of town, holding borrowed rods from the local bait shop. The morning air was crisp, and their breath made little clouds as Grant showed David how to hold the rod. "Like this," Grant demonstrated, guiding David's small hands. "Now pull back slowly and release." The line arced gracefully over the water. "I did it!" David exclaimed as the lure splashed down. Did you see?" "Perfect cast," Grant praised, his heart swelling with unexpected pride. They spent hours by that pond, not catching anything but sharing stories. David told him about school, his best friend Miguel, and how he wanted to be an artist, or maybe an astronaut when he grew up. Grant found himself sharing memories of his own childhood fishing trips, carefully editing out the parts about his stern father. As the afternoon sun began to fade, they returned their borrowed gear and walked Lila home from her shift at the hospital. Grant observed the neighborhood with new eyes, noting the broken street light, the cracked sidewalks, the way Lila kept David close when they passed certain buildings. In her small kitchen, while David did homework at the coffee table, Lila made coffee in a battered pot. She pulled out a worn folder from a cabinet, spreading its contents on the table. "I want you to see these," she said quietly. "Every medical bill, every school record, every time I had to choose between new shoes for him or paying the electric bill. I never asked for help, never tried to contact you for money." Grant leafed through the papers, his businessman's eye noting the late payments, the payment plans, the careful budgeting. "You did all this alone?" "We managed," Lila said simply. "David never went hungry. He always had clean clothes, even if they were from thrift stores. I wanted you to know I never kept him from you for financial gain." "Let me help you now," Grant said, looking around the small apartment. "I can find you a safer neighborhood, a better school." "No." Lila's voice was firm but gentle. "We don't need grand gestures or fancy changes. What we need, what David needs, is peace, stability. A father who shows up for pancake breakfasts and fishing trips, not one who throws money at problems from a distance." Grant started to argue but stopped himself, remembering David's face when he'd made that first perfect cast. No amount of money could buy that moment. Later that night, as Grant drove his expensive car back toward the city lights, he couldn't shake the image of David falling asleep against Lila's shoulder as they'd said goodbye. The boy had clutched his tackle shop cap, a small gift from Grant, even in sleep. The highway stretched before him, but his mind stayed in that small apartment, with its worn furniture and walls covered in David's artwork. For the first time in years, his penthouse felt less like a sanctuary and more like what it truly was. An empty space filled with expensive things that meant nothing compared to a child's smile over chocolate chip pancakes. 2 days had passed like a peaceful dream. Grant had just finished reviewing quarterly reports in his office when his phone buzzed with an urgent message from his PR director. His stomach dropped as he clicked the link. There on his screen was a grainy photo of him, Lila, and David at Pete's Diner. The headline screamed in bold letters, "Billionaire's hidden love child." Below it, more photos showed them at the fishing pond, walking down Main Street, David wearing Grant's coat when the wind picked up. Grant's hands trembled as he scrolled through the article. Someone at the diner had recognized him and sold the story. The piece painted Lila as a calculating former employee who had hidden his heir for years, suggesting scandal and deception. His office phone lit up like a Christmas tree. Board members, investors, reporters, all demanding answers. His secretary buzzed through, her voice tight with tension. "Sir, the board has called an emergency meeting. They're waiting in the conference room." Grant straightened his tie and walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Through the glass walls he could see them, 12 faces carved from stone, documents spread before them like weapons. This is a disaster. Marcus Chen, the head of the board, didn't wait for Grant to sit down. "The stock is already dropping. We need to get ahead of this immediately." Patricia Reynolds, their PR expert, slid a prepared statement across the table. "A simple denial. We say the photos are being misinterpreted, that you're merely visiting a charity case from one of your foundations." Grant picked up the paper, read it once, then deliberately tore it in half. "No, he said quietly. Grant, be reasonable. Marcus leaned forward. Think of the shareholders, the company's reputation. I said no. Grant's voice carried the steel that had built his empire. I won't deny my son. The room erupted in protests. Words like scandal and damage control bounced off the walls. Grant held up his hand for silence. I'm releasing my own statement, he said, pulling out his phone. As they watched, he typed and sent a simple message to his PR team. Grant, Whitmore confirms he is spending personal time with family and requests privacy during this period of reconnection. You can't do this? Patricia's face had gone pale. The media will have a field day. I already did. Grant stood up, buttoning his jacket. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have more important matters to attend to. He left them sitting there, their protests fading behind him. By the time he reached his car, his phone showed 37 missed calls, and the first news alerts were already popping up. Henry, his chauffeur, was waiting with the car door open. Quite a storm brewing, sir. Take me home, Henry. I need to pack some things. As they drove, Grant watched the city blur past his window. News vans were already gathering outside his company's headquarters. On social media, Whitmore Air was trending. His phone buzzed with a text from Lila. Help. Change of plans. Grant told Henry. Get me to Cedar Grove Apartments, fast. They arrived to find 3 news vans parked outside Lila's building. Reporters swarmed the sidewalk where Lila stood frozen, grocery bags clutched to her chest, David hiding behind her legs. Camera flashes popped like lightning. Grant didn't wait for Henry to open his door. He burst out of the car, pushing through the crowd. Shrugging off his coat, he wrapped it around both Lila and David, creating a shield from the cameras. Mr. Whitmore, is this your son? Ms. Carter, how much money did you demand for silence? David, look this way! Grant's arm tightened around them as he guided them through the gauntlet of reporters. No comment, he repeated firmly, using his body to block the worst of the photographers. Inside the apartment, David ran to his room while Loila collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. The grocery bags lay forgotten by the door, a carton of eggs broken on the floor. I told you, she sobbed as Grant sat beside her. I told you they'd ruin us. This is exactly what I was afraid of all those years ago. Grant pulled her close, letting her cry against his shoulder. The expensive fabric of his suit grew damp with her tears, but he didn't care. Outside, camera flashes still lit up the window like silent lightning. Look at me, he said finally, gently lifting her chin. Her eyes were red, mascara smudged beneath them. No one is ruining us this time. Not the media, not the board, not anyone. How can you say that? She whispered. They're turning us into a circus. They're making me look like some kind of gold digger. David will have to face this at school. Because this time I'm here, Grant said firmly. And I'm not running away. He wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. I'm calling a press conference for tomorrow morning. What? Lila pulled back, alarmed. No, that will only make it worse. Trust me, Grant said softly. Please, just this once, let me handle this my way. From down the hall, they heard a small sniffle. David stood in his doorway, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. Are they going to make us move away? He asked in a trembling voice. Grant crossed the room and knelt before his son. No one's making us go anywhere. Come here, buddy. He opened his arms, and David ran into them, burying his face in Grant's neck. I don't like the cameras, David mumbled. They scared Mom. I know. Grant stroked his son's hair. But tomorrow I'm going to make sure they understand that we're a family, and families protect each other. Lila joined them, wrapping her arms around them both. They stayed like that for a long moment, while outside the media circus raged on. Grant's phone buzzed continuously in his pocket, but he ignored it. Finally, he pulled back and looked at them both. This beautiful, strong woman who had raised their son alone, and this precious boy who had his eyes and his mother's gentle heart. "Henry's waiting downstairs," he said. "Pack some things. You'll stay at my house tonight where security can protect you. Tomorrow morning, we face this together." As Lila and David gathered their overnight bags, Grant made 2 calls. The first was to his head of security, arranging protection for the press conference. The second was to his PR team, telling them to schedule the announcement for 9 o'clock sharp. Tomorrow he would tell the world the truth, not as the cold corporate titan they expected, but as a man who had found something far more valuable than all his wealth, a second chance at love and family. Through the window, he could still see camera flashes, hear shouted questions. But inside this small apartment, holding his son's hand and watching Lila pack David's favorite pajamas, Grant felt more peaceful than he had in years. Sometimes he realized the right decision was also the hardest one. But this time, he would not let fear or pride stand in his way. This time, he would fight for what mattered most. The Grand Plaza Hotel's ballroom buzzed with anticipation. Camera crews jostled for position, their equipment creating a maze of cables across the polished floor. Grant Whitmore stood behind the stage curtain, adjusting his tie for the 100th time. "2 minutes, sir," Henry murmured, standing guard nearby. Grant nodded, his fingers touching the small photo in his pocket. The one from David's letter that had started it all. 7 years of lost time. Not anymore. The lights dimmed, then brightened. Grant walked to the podium, his footsteps echoing through the suddenly silent room. 200 faces stared back at him, notebooks and cameras ready. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I've called this press conference to address the recent speculation about my personal life, but more importantly, to right a wrong that has gone on far too long." He paused, looking directly into the main camera that was broadcasting live. 7 years ago, during my late wife's illness, I found comfort in the friendship of someone who showed extraordinary kindness to both of us. Lila Carter worked in our household, but she was more than an employee. She was a beacon of hope during our darkest days. Cameras clicked rapidly. Grant continued, his voice growing stronger. "What many don't know is that from that friendship came the greatest blessing of my life, my son, David. Yes, the rumors are true. David Carter is my son, and I couldn't be prouder to acknowledge that fact today." The room erupted. Reporters shot to their feet, shouting questions. Grant raised his hand, waiting for quiet. "I understand you have questions. Yes, I only recently learned about David. No, Ms. Carter never asked for money or special treatment. In fact, she raised our son alone, working multiple jobs, showing the kind of strength and dignity that humbles me." In her small apartment, Lila sat on her worn couch, watching the broadcast. Tears rolled down her cheeks as Grant spoke about her with such respect. "But this press conference isn't just about acknowledging my son," Grant continued. "It's about taking action. Today, I'm announcing the creation of the David Whitmore Foundation, with an initial endowment of $50 million. More commotion filled the room. Grant's voice rose above it. "This foundation will focus on providing safe, affordable housing for single parents and their children. No parent should have to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. No child should worry about where they'll sleep at night." He pulled out the photo from his pocket, holding it up. "This picture represents both my greatest regret and my greatest hope. Regret for the years lost, hope for the years ahead. To single parents everywhere who struggle alone, we see you. To children growing up without all their family present, we hear you." In her apartment, Lila pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by emotion. The foundation's name, their son's name, blurred through her tears. The press conference continued for another hour. Grant answered questions with patience and honesty, never flinching from the hard ones. Yes, he had made mistakes. Yes, there would be changes at his company. No, he wouldn't discuss his father's role in past events. Finally, exhausted but peaceful, Grant drove to Lila's apartment that evening. The media circus had moved back to his office, leaving the street quiet. He knocked softly, hearing David's excited footsteps running to the door. "Dad!" David threw himself into Grant's arms. The word still made Grant's heart skip a beat. "Hey, buddy." He hugged his son tight. "Did you watch TV today?" "Mom cried," David reported seriously, but she said they were happy tears. Lila appeared from the kitchen, wearing an old apron, her eyes still red but smiling. "I made soup," she said softly, "and cornbread. Nothing fancy." "It's perfect," Grant said, following them to the tiny kitchen. The soup was simple vegetable, the cornbread slightly crooked, but to Grant it was the finest meal he'd had in years. They ate together, David chattering about his day at school, how his teacher had been nice and kept the other kids from asking too many questions. After dinner, David reluctantly went to bed, making Grant promise 3 times to come back tomorrow. In the quiet living room, Grant and Lila sat on opposite ends of the couch, years of unspoken words between them. "The foundation," Lila finally said, "it's incredible, but using his name. I wanted everyone to know how proud I am of him." Grant said, "Of both of you. There was a time I hated you." Lila admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "Not for what happened between us, but for not being there when I tried to tell you about him." "I know." Grant's voice was heavy with regret. "I was buried in work, hiding from my grief over Caroline. I made myself unreachable. Even when I was angriest," Lila continued, "I never stopped praying for you. Every night, David and I would pray, for his father's happiness, for his heart to be open to love again." Grant's throat tightened. "I haven't prayed since Caroline died." He confessed, "I was too angry at God, but lately, something's changing. Watching David pray at dinner last night, seeing his simple faith, it makes me wonder if I've been wrong all these years." They talked for hours, sharing memories of Caroline's last days, of the comfort they'd found in each other's friendship, of the fear and loneliness that followed their separation. The wall clock ticked past midnight, but neither noticed. Finally, Grant stood to leave. Lila walked him to the door, where he paused, looking down at her tired but beautiful face. "Thank you," he said softly, "for raising him to be such an amazing boy, for never turning him against me, for—" he struggled to find the words, "for still praying, even when I didn't deserve it." Gently he leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead, lingering for just a moment. Then he was gone, leaving Lila touching the spot where his lips had been, her heart full of cautious hope. Through David's partially open door, they could hear his soft breathing, peaceful and untroubled by the day's events. In that moment, both Grant and Lila silently thanked God for the miracle of second chances. The mountain estate loomed before them, its stone facade catching the late afternoon light. Lila gripped her worn suitcase tighter, fighting the urge to retreat to the safety of their small apartment. But David's excitement was contagious as he bounced in place beside her, his eyes wide with wonder. "It's like a castle, Mom!" he exclaimed, his voice echoing across the circular driveway. Grant stepped out of his car behind them, watching their reactions with careful eyes. "Henry will bring your bags up," he said softly, nodding to his chauffeur. "Please, make yourselves at home." Lila couldn't help but remember the last time she'd walked through these doors, 7 years ago, carrying cleaning supplies instead of a suitcase. The grand foyer still took her breath away. Marble floors, sweeping staircase, crystal chandelier casting rainbow spots on the walls. "Can I explore?" David asked, practically vibrating with energy. Before either parent could answer, a warm voice called from the top of the stairs, "Well, who do we have here?" Mrs. Martha Avery descended, her silver hair neat as always, her kind face creased in a welcoming smile. She'd been the head housekeeper for 20 years, having served Grant's family since before his marriage to Caroline. "This must be young Master David," she said, reaching the bottom step. "I'm Mrs. Avery, and I've just finished baking chocolate chip cookies." David's face lit up, but he looked to his mother for permission. Lila nodded, and he bounded up the stairs, taking Mrs. Avery's offered hand. "The kitchen's right this way, dear," Mrs. Avery said, throwing a meaningful look at Grant over her shoulder. "Let's give your parents a moment to settle in." Grant cleared his throat. "I'll show you to your rooms," he said to Lila. "They're in the east wing, where it's quietest." They climbed the stairs in silence, their footsteps muffled by thick carpet. The hallways seemed endless, lined with artwork and antiques that probably cost more than Lila made in a year. "Here." Grant opened a door, revealing a suite that made Lila's apartment look like a closet. "David's room connects to yours through that door. I thought he might feel safer that way." Lila touched the silk bedspread, fighting back tears at his thoughtfulness. "Thank you," she managed. "I know this isn't easy," Grant said quietly, "trusting me again after everything. But the media circus at your apartment, I couldn't bear thinking of you both trapped there." From somewhere down the hall came the sound of David's laughter, mixed with Mrs. Avery's warm chuckle. The sound seemed to brighten the whole house. That evening, after unpacking their modest belongings, they gathered in the kitchen. Mrs. Avery insisted on making David's favorite, spaghetti and meatballs, having coaxed his preferences from him during their cookie-eating session. "This house hasn't heard proper laughter in far too long," Mrs. Avery commented, watching David twirl pasta with determined concentration. The next morning dawned clear and crisp. Lila woke early, habit from years of dawn shifts, and found Mrs. Avery already in the kitchen. "Join me, dear," the older woman said, pulling out ingredients. "Mr. Grant mentioned David loves pancakes." Together they mixed batter while Mrs. Avery shared stories of Grant's own childhood pancake adventures. Soon the kitchen filled with warm vanilla scents and the sizzle of butter. David appeared first, drawn by the smell, still in his dinosaur pajamas. Grant followed shortly after, looking surprisingly casual in weekend clothes instead of his usual suit. "Real pancakes," David exclaimed, climbing onto a kitchen stool. "Mom usually only has time for frozen ones." They ate together at the kitchen island, passing maple syrup and fresh berries. Mrs. Avery had somehow produced whipped cream in the shape of smiley faces on David's stack. The morning sun streamed through wide windows, warming the comfortable scene. After breakfast, Grant hesitated, then asked Lila, Would you like to see the garden?" She followed him through French doors onto a stone terrace. Below stretched what had once been Caroline's pride and joy, a formal garden now gone wild. Roses climbed untamed over trellises, herbs sprawled beyond their beds, weeds poked through gravel paths. "I couldn't bear to change anything after—" Grant's voice trailed off. The gardeners maintained the lawn, but this space was hers. Lila knelt beside an overgrown lavender bush, gently touching the fragrant leaves. "She loved this garden," she said softly. "I remember helping her plant these very herbs. Would you—" Grant paused, uncertain. "Would you help me bring it back? not to change what she created, but to honor it? Lila stood, brushing dirt from her knees. I'd like that, she said simply. Over the next few days, the house seemed to wake from a long slumber. David's footsteps echoed through halls that had known only silence. His artwork appeared on the refrigerator, bright crayon drawings bringing color to the professional kitchen. In the evenings, Mrs. Avery discovered David had a gift for music. She began teaching him simple tunes on the grand piano in the living room. The hesitant notes of heart and soul filled the house, while Grant and Lila worked in the garden, carefully bringing order to the beloved space. Fresh flowers appeared in vases, not formal arrangements from florists, but simple bouquets of what they'd pruned that day. David proudly contributed dandelions he'd picked from the lawn, and these were displayed with equal prominence. One evening, Grant found Lila in the library, running her fingers along leather-bound spines. Caroline used to read here for hours, he said quietly. I remember, Lila replied. She always shared her books with the staff, said good stories were meant to be passed along. Grant moved closer, his voice soft. This house, it was like a tomb after she died. I stayed away as much as I could, buried myself in work. But now, Lila prompted gently. Now it feels alive again. David's laughter, your flowers, even Mrs. Avery humming while she cooks. It's like the house can breathe again. From the living room came the sound of David practicing his piano lesson, the simple melody mixing with Mrs. Avery's patient instruction. The evening sun slanted through tall windows, catching dust motes that danced in the warm light. Lila smiled, thinking how quickly the massive house had begun to feel like home. Not because of its grandeur or luxury, but because of the life they were breathing back into its rooms, one day at a time. In the garden, new growth was already visible where they'd cleared and pruned. Like the house itself, Carolyn's beloved space was slowly coming back to life, nurtured by care and patience and love. The transformation wasn't just in the house and gardens. Grant's shoulders had lost their rigid set. His smile came more easily. Lila found herself relaxing, letting go of old fears, and David bloomed like one of Caroline's roses, filling every corner of the estate with his innocent joy. Even Mrs. Avery noticed the change, watching with quiet satisfaction as warmth returned to rooms that had been cold for far too long. In her wisdom, she saw how 3 wounded hearts were healing together, bringing life back to a house that had forgotten how to be a home. The evening settled softly over the mountain estate. Dinner dishes had been cleared, and the dining room glowed warmly under crystal chandeliers. David sat at the massive mahogany table, his math workbook spread before him, tongue poking out in concentration as he worked through his multiplication tables. Lila leaned over his shoulder, her gentle voice guiding him. That's right, sweetheart. 7 times 8 is 56. Grant sat at the far end of the table with his laptop, occasionally glancing up from spreadsheets to watch them. The sight of them together made something twist in his chest. Pride mixed with regret for all the homework sessions he'd missed. Mum, why do we need to know times tables anyway? David's pencil tapped against the page in frustration. Well, Lila smiled. Remember when we were baking cookies yesterday? We had to double the recipe. That's multiplication in real life. Grant couldn't help but chuckle. Your mother's right. I use multiplication every day in business. David's eyes widened. Even with all those fancy computers? Even then. The computers help, but you need to understand the math yourself first. They worked through a few more problems together, David's confidence growing with each correct answer. When the last problem was solved, he carefully packed up his school supplies in his backpack, a new one Grant had insisted on buying him. Time for bed, young man, Lila said, checking her watch. Did you brush your teeth? Yes, Mom. David gathered his things, then hesitated. Could Dad come say good night, too? Grant's heart skipped at the word Dad. It still felt new, precious. Of course, son. They walked David to his room together, watching as he climbed into the big bed that seemed to swallow his small frame. Lila tucked the covers around him, while Grant awkwardly smoothed the blanket. Good night, sweetheart. Lila kissed his forehead. Sleep well, son. Grant added softly. They stood in the doorway, watching as David's eyes drifted closed, his breathing evening out into the peaceful rhythm of sleep. The sight of him there, safe and content, filled them both with quiet joy. Back downstairs, Grant headed to the kitchen and returned with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Would you join me on the terrace? The night's clear, and I had the heaters turned on out there. Lila nodded, accepting the coffee. They stepped through the French doors onto the covered terrace, where powerful heating elements kept the mountain chill at bay. Comfortable chairs surrounded a low table, and twinkling lights strung overhead cast a gentle glow. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching their breath mist in the cool air. A few tentative snowflakes began to drift down, catching the light like falling stars. I've been thinking about faith lately, Grant said suddenly, his voice quiet. After Caroline died, I was so angry at God. I stopped going to church, stopped praying, threw myself into work instead. Lila cradled her coffee cup, letting its warmth seep into her hands. I understand that anger. When your father fired me, when I realized I'd have to raise David alone, I was angry too, but my faith was all I had left. How did you hold on to it? Some days I barely did, she admitted. But then I'd look at David, see how perfectly he was made, how much love God put into creating him. I couldn't stay angry. He was my miracle, even if he came from a broken place. Grant's hands tightened around his mug. We were both so broken then. After Caroline got sick, everything fell apart. I couldn't save her, couldn't fix it with money or power or anything else. And I was grieving too, Lila said softly. She wasn't just my employer. She was kind to me, treated me like a friend. That night, Grant's voice grew husky with memory. We were both seeking comfort in our pain. I've thought about it so many times over the years. I tried to forget it, Lila whispered. Tried to bury it under anger and hurt when your father dismissed me. But I couldn't, not really. Not when I looked at David and saw your eyes looking back at me. Grant set his coffee down, turned to face her fully. Lila, I need to thank you for raising our son so beautifully, for teaching him kindness and strength, for never trying to use him against me or demand anything from me, even when you had every right to. Tears glimmered in Lila's eyes. I wanted to hate you sometimes. It would have been easier, but I couldn't because I... She paused, gathering courage. Because I loved you. Not just that night, but before. Quietly, hopelessly, watching you with Caroline, seeing how good you were to her. I buried those feelings so deep, covered them with bitterness, but they never really went away. Snow fell more steadily now, creating a curtain of white beyond the terrace roof. Grant reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. Her fingers were warm from the coffee cup, trembling slightly in his grasp. That night wasn't a mistake, he said firmly. Yes, it came from a place of pain and grief, but what we created. He gestured toward the house where David slept. That was beautiful, pure. Maybe God knew exactly what he was doing, giving us David to heal us both. Lila's free hand came up to brush away tears. I've prayed for you every day, even when I was angriest. Prayed you'd find peace. Find your faith again." Grant shifted closer, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Maybe he was listening, because finding you and David, it's waking something in me I thought had died with Caroline. The snow fell harder, creating a peaceful cocoon around them. The terrace lights twinkled overhead like stars, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called softly into the night. Grant lifted his free hand to Lila's cheek, brushing away a tear with his thumb. Time seemed to slow as he leaned forward, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Lila stayed still, her eyes meeting his with trust and something deeper, something that had survived 7 years of separation. When his lips met hers, it was gentle. Not the desperate kiss of that long-ago night, but something tender and healing. Her hand came up to rest against his chest, and he could feel her trembling slightly beneath his touch. The kiss lasted only moments, but when they parted, something had shifted between them. The weight of unspoken words, of buried feelings and old hurts, seemed lighter somehow. Like the falling snow was covering over their past pain, leaving everything clean and new. They sat together in the peaceful quiet, hands still linked, watching the snow transform the world around them into something pure and beautiful. Neither felt the need to speak. Their hearts had said enough. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the estate grounds as Grant stood in the restored garden, making final adjustments to the fairy lights he'd strung between the trees. His hands trembled slightly as he checked his pocket for the 100th time, feeling the velvet box nestled safely inside. For 3 days, he'd worked in secret with the groundskeepers to bring Caroline's old garden back to life, the garden Lila had once tended with such care. Fresh mulch lined the neat beds where spring bulbs waited beneath the soil. Rose bushes, carefully pruned, stood ready for the coming season. Stone pathways had been power-washed clean, and new benches offered quiet spots for reflection. Mrs. Avery appeared at his elbow, straightening her cardigan. "Everything's ready, Mr. Whitmore. Young David and I will be playing chess on the side porch, close enough to peek, but far enough to give you privacy." She patted his arm with grandmotherly affection. "Don't look so nervous. That woman loves you something fierce." Grant managed a shaky smile. "Thank you, Martha, for everything." "Oh, go on now." She waved him away, but her eyes sparkled with happiness. "Henry's bringing her down in 5 minutes. David and I have our instructions to keep our distance until we hear happy screaming." As Mrs. Avery bustled away, Grant paced the garden path, remembering how he'd first noticed Lila here years ago. She'd been singing softly while pruning roses, her dark hair caught in the morning light. Even then, something about her gentleness had touched him. The sun dipped lower, and the fairy lights began to twinkle more visibly among the branches. Grant heard the crunch of gravel on the path and turned to see Henry escorting Lila toward the garden entrance. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, and her eyes widened as she took in the transformed space. "Grant?" she called softly, stepping into the garden. "What is all this?" He moved to meet her, taking both her hands in his. "Do you remember this place?" Lila's eyes grew misty as she looked around. "Of course I do. I spent so many mornings here, talking with Caroline while I worked. She loved this garden so much." She touched a rose bush gently. "It's beautiful again, just like it used to be." "You made it beautiful back then," Grant said, his voice thick with emotion. "You brought life to everything you touched. The garden, this house, the people in it." He squeezed her hands. "Even me, though I didn't realize it at the time." From the side porch came the sound of David's laughter, as Mrs. Avery apparently made some amusing chess move. Lila's face softened at the sound, and Grant felt his heart swell with love for them both. "You know," he said, allowing a hint of teasing into his voice, "I still can't believe you thought you could hide my son." He shook his head, smiling. Those eyes of his, they gave him away the moment I saw him. Lila blushed and laughed through her tears. "I didn't exactly hide him very well, did I? He has your determination, too. Once he decided to give you that letter, nothing could stop him." "Thank God for that." Grant released one of her hands to reach into his pocket. "Because finding him led me back to you, and now I never want to let either of you go again." Lila's breath caught as he dropped to one knee, opening the velvet box to reveal a stunning diamond ring. It wasn't ostentatious. He knew her too well for that, but it sparkled with quiet elegance, just like her. "Lila Carter," he said, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "I'm not offering charity or obligation. I'm offering my heart, my name, my future. I want us to be a real family, you, me, and our amazing son. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down Lila's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, with all my heart." Grant's hands shook slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he stood and pulled her close, kissing her with all the love and gratitude he felt. Their moment was interrupted by a whoop of joy from the porch, followed by the sound of running feet. David burst into the garden, his face glowing with excitement. Mrs. Avery followed more slowly, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Did she say yes? Did you ask her? Are we going to be a real family now?" Grant caught his son up in his arms, lifting him high as Lila wrapped her arms around them both. "Yes to all of that, buddy. How would you like to have dinner together and talk about it?" "Can we have it in the kitchen?" David asked eagerly. "The dining room's too fancy." Lila laughed. "The kitchen sounds perfect." They made their way inside, where Mrs. Avery had already prepared a feast of comfort food, pot roast with vegetables, fresh bread, and an apple pie cooling on the counter. The kitchen glowed with warmth from both the oven and the love filling the room. As they settled around the kitchen island, David perched on a stool between them. Questions tumbled from their son's eager mouth. "Are we really all going to live here together? Forever and ever? Can I help plan the wedding? Will there be cake?" "Yes to living together," Grant assured him, serving up generous portions of pot roast. "Forever and ever. And of course there will be cake at the wedding." "The biggest cake ever," David declared, making both his parents laugh. They lingered over dinner, talking and planning, sharing stories and dreams. Mrs. Avery bustled around them, refilling water glasses and beaming like a proud grandmother. The ring caught the kitchen lights as Lila gestured, making rainbow sparkles dance across the walls. When David began to yawn despite his excitement, they knew it was bedtime. For the first time, they tucked him in together, Grant on one side of the bed, Lila on the other. David snuggled down between them, his eyes already heavy with sleep. "I love you, Mommy and Daddy," he murmured as his eyes drifted closed. Lila's hand found Grant's across the top of David's pillow, their fingers intertwining. In that moment, watching their son sleep peacefully between them, they both felt it deep in their souls. This was exactly where they belonged. The morning sun streamed through the grand windows of the Whitmore estate, casting warm patches across the polished hardwood floors. Grant stood in the kitchen, watching Lila teach David how to make French toast. The simple domesticity of the scene made his heart swell. "Don't forget the cinnamon," David said seriously, carefully sprinkling the spice into the egg mixture. "You're becoming quite the chef." Grant chuckled, reaching for his coffee mug. The sharp ring of the doorbell cut through their peaceful morning. Henry's voice crackled over the intercom. "Sir, Miss Miranda Lowell is here. quite insistent on seeing you." Grant's jaw tightened. Miranda hadn't been part of his life since their broken engagement 3 years ago. "I'll handle this," he told Lila, touching her shoulder gently. "Keep making breakfast with our master chef here." But before he could reach the front door, Miranda swept past Henry into the foyer, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. She clutched a thick manila envelope in one manicured hand and several tabloid magazines in the other. "Really, Grant?" she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "I had to find out about your supposed son through the gossip columns?" Grant stepped between Miranda and the hallway leading to the kitchen. "This isn't a good time, Miranda. Whatever you came to say, oh, but it's the perfect time." She pulled papers from the envelope, thrusting them at his chest. "These just came back from Gene Tech Labs. I had them rush the results because I was concerned about you being taken advantage of." Grant's stomach clenched as he scanned the documents. Bold letters proclaimed "exclusion of paternity" across the top of the page. "That's impossible," he said, his voice hollow. "I never authorized any DNA testing." Miranda's red lips curved into a satisfied smile. "I still had access to your medical records from when we were engaged. It wasn't hard to get a sample." She pulled out more papers. Bank statements, old newspaper clippings. "Did you know your little maid friend has quite a history of financial troubles? 3 maxed-out credit cards, 2 eviction notices before she worked for your family." "Get out!" Grant growled. But Miranda wasn't finished. "Face it, darling. She saw an opportunity and took it. That boy may look like you, but it's just a convenient coincidence. She's playing you for a fool, and everyone can see it but you." Grant's hands shook as he examined the lab results more closely. Something about the letterhead seemed off, slightly blurred, as if photocopied. "These aren't real," he said slowly. "What did you do, Miranda?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, before she masked it with another smirk. "I did what I had to do to protect you. That lab technician was quite helpful once I explained the situation, and offered the right motivation, of course." The sound of a stifled gasp made them both turn. Lila stood in the hallway, her face pale. Grant's heart dropped as he realized how this must look. Him holding DNA test results, Miranda's triumphant expression. "Lila, wait," he started, but she was already backing away. "You had me tested?" Her voice cracked. "All this time you didn't believe me?" "No, that's not—" "Oh, honey," Miranda cut in smoothly. "Can you blame him? A wealthy man has to protect himself. Though I must say, your little con was quite clever." "Miranda, shut up!" Grant snapped. But the damage was done. He could see the walls slamming up behind Lila's eyes, the trust they'd built crumbling away. "I'll be in the kitchen with my son," Lila said coldly, emphasizing the last word. "Please see your guest out." Grant grabbed Miranda's arm, practically dragging her to the door. "You've done enough damage. If you ever come near my family again—" "Family?" Miranda laughed. "Wake up, Grant. She's already planning her escape. But don't worry, darling. I'll be here when you finally see the truth." He slammed the door in her face and rushed back toward the kitchen, but Lila and David were already gone upstairs. The half-mixed French toast batter sat abandoned on the counter, cinnamon dusting the surface like scattered dreams. Throughout the day, Grant tried desperately to explain, but Lila kept David close, avoiding private conversations. She spoke only when necessary, her responses clipped and formal. The ring on her finger seemed to mock him now, its sparkle dimmed by the shadow of doubt Miranda had cast. That night, Grant tossed and turned in his bed, unable to sleep. Around 3 a.m, he heard soft footsteps in the hallway. By the time he reached the door, the house was silent again. They were gone. The note on the kitchen counter was brief. "I won't let anyone question my son's identity or my integrity again. Please don't look for us." Grant's world spun out of control. He called Henry, who was already racing to check local transportation hubs. He contacted the police, but without evidence of danger, they couldn't treat it as more than a domestic dispute. He reached out to old friends, business contacts, anyone who might have seen them. Nothing. As dawn painted the sky in cruel shades of pink and gold, Grant stood in the garden where he'd proposed just days before. The fairy lights still hung between the trees, now lifeless and grey in the morning light. In his fist he clutched Lila's engagement ring, found on his desk beside a single pressed flower from the garden. The morning dew soaked through his shoes as he stood there, staring at the empty spaces where his family should be. Where David should be chasing butterflies and Lila should be tending to her beloved flowers. The garden that had finally started to bloom again now seemed to mock him with its half-finished restoration, like everything else in his life. Beautiful, but incomplete. Henry appeared at his side, his usually stoic face lined with concern. "Sir, I've checked all the local airports and train stations. No sign of them yet, but we'll find them." Grant didn't respond. He couldn't find the words to express how thoroughly Miranda had destroyed everything he held dear. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. His ex-fiancée had succeeded in taking away his chance at true happiness, all while pretending to protect him from imaginary deception. The ring in his palm caught the morning light, sending prisms dancing across the dewy grass. Each rainbow fragment seemed to taunt him with memories of family dinners, shared laughter, and the promise of a future now shattered by a vengeful lie. The autumn leaves turned to winter frost as weeks crawled by without any sign of Lila and David. Grant's once pristine office became a shrine to his search. Maps dotted with pins, folders stuffed with detective reports, and David's crayon drawings carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. The corporate vultures didn't wait long to strike. The morning papers screamed headlines about instability at Whitmore Industries. Shareholders whispered about erratic behavior and questionable judgment. The board members who had once bowed to his every word now gathered in closed-door meetings, their faces grim with disapproval. "The market is losing confidence, Grant," Bernard Matthews, his longest-serving board member, declared during an emergency meeting. The mahogany conference table stretched between them like a battlefield. "Your personal situation has become a liability." Grant barely looked up from the private investigator's latest report. "Is that so?" "The scandal isn't going away. Investors are nervous. Your hunt for this woman and her child, it's affecting share prices." "Their names are Lila and David," Grant said quietly, his voice cutting through the murmurs around the table. "And they're my family." Charles Wilson, the CFO, cleared his throat. "That's exactly the problem, Grant. This soap opera has to end. The board has prepared a statement denying paternity and distancing the company from—" "No." Grant finally looked up, his eyes hard. "I won't deny my son." "Then you leave us no choice." Bernard slid a thick document across the table. "We're requesting your resignation." The room fell silent. 20 years ago, this moment would have destroyed Grant. His identity had been so wrapped up in this company, in the power it represented. Now, looking at the stark black and white text demanding his surrender of control, he felt nothing but relief. He pulled out his fountain pen, a gift from his father when he'd first joined the company, and signed without hesitation. The scratching of the nib against paper seemed deafening in the shocked silence. "You're making a mistake," Charles warned as Grant stood to leave. "Everything you've built—" "I built an empire of empty offices and cold numbers." Grant interrupted. "I'm done measuring my worth in stock prices." He left his keycard on the table and walked out, never looking back at the stunned faces of his former colleagues. Henry waited with the car, his expression sympathetic but unsurprised. "Where to, sir?" "The bank first, then the real estate office." The next days blurred together in a flurry of signatures and handshakes. Grant liquidated his non-essential assets, closed accounts, and transferred funds. His penthouse went on the market. The vacation homes in Aspen and Martha's Vineyard followed. Each sale felt like shedding a layer of his old life, stripping away the trappings of wealth that had insulated him from real connections. The private investigators he'd hired reported dead ends. Lila had been careful, using cash and staying off the grid. The charities he contacted, women's shelters, family support organizations, couldn't or wouldn't share information. Each failure felt like another crack in his heart. Finally, on a crisp morning that reminded him painfully of the day he'd first met David, Grant drove to St. Michael's Elementary. The school looked smaller somehow, its brick walls less imposing than he remembered. Children's artwork decorated the windows, bright splashes of color against the gray December sky. The principal, Mrs. Jenkins, recognized him immediately. Her kind face softened with sympathy as she led him to her office. "I was hoping—" Grant's voice caught. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I wondered if David had left any forwarding information." Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore. His mother only told us they were moving for family reasons." She hesitated, then opened her desk drawer. "But David did leave something. He asked me to keep it safe, just in case." She handed him a folded piece of construction paper, slightly crumpled at the edges. Grant's hands trembled as he opened it. The drawing was simple. 3 stick figures holding hands, standing beneath a bright yellow sun. The tallest wore what looked like a tie. The middle figure had long hair, and the smallest had a big smile. Above them, in careful child's handwriting, were the words, "One day we'll be together." The car's leather seats felt cold against Grant's back as he slumped behind the wheel. He stared at the drawing through tears that wouldn't stop falling, each drop marking the paper like tiny stamps of grief. For the first time since his wife's death, he allowed himself to truly break down. Henry found him there an hour later, still clutching the drawing. The chauffeur quietly slid into the driver's seat, keeping his eyes forward to give his employer privacy. "They have to be somewhere, Henry," Grant whispered, his voice raw. "I can't lose them again." "We'll find them, sir," Henry assured him, starting the engine. "Family has a way of finding its way home." Grant carefully tucked the drawing into his breast pocket, close to his heart. The stick figures seemed to mock him with their simple happiness, a child's vision of what should have been. Yet somehow, the words above them felt less like a goodbye and more like a promise. The school bell rang in the distance, releasing a flood of children into waiting parents' arms. Grant watched through blurry eyes as families reunited, remembered David's shy smile that first day, remembered Lila's face in the soft evening light when she'd said yes to his proposal. The memories hurt, but they were all he had now. As Henry drove them away from the school, Grant pressed his forehead against the cool window glass. The world outside continued its normal rhythm. People hurrying to meetings, couples walking hand in hand, parents pushing strollers. None of them knew that his world had stopped turning the moment Lila and David disappeared. His phone buzzed with messages from the board, from lawyers, from business reporters seeking comments on his resignation. He turned it off without reading them. None of it mattered anymore. His empire could crumble to dust, his name could vanish from headlines, and he wouldn't care, as long as he could find his family again. The drawing crinkled softly against his chest with each breath, David's crayon promise a constant reminder of what he was fighting for. One day, somehow, they would be together. He had to believe that. It was all he had left. The mountain air felt different here, cleaner somehow. Grant stood on the small wooden porch of his newly purchased cabin, watching the sunrise paint the Colorado Rockies in shades of pink and gold. His expensive suits now hung forgotten in a closet, replaced by worn jeans and flannel shirts. The cabin itself was modest, just 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with dated appliances, and a living room with a stone fireplace. But it felt more like home than his penthouse ever had. The transformation hadn't been easy. Selling the penthouse had meant confronting memories, dinner parties with influential guests, late nights reviewing contracts, and more recently, David's laughter echoing through those vast rooms. Each item he packed reminded him of what he'd lost. His realtor had been shocked when he'd chosen this simple cabin instead of another luxury property, but Grant knew he needed the change. He sipped his coffee, made in a basic drip machine now, not the $1,000 espresso maker he'd once prized. Henry, who had refused to leave his employment despite the dramatic downsizing, pulled up in Grant's old Range Rover, now showing signs of wear. "Ready for another day, sir?" Henry asked, his familiar presence a comfort in this new life. Grant nodded, grabbing his worn leather jacket. "The shelter needs help with breakfast service." The Denver family shelter was nothing like the charity galas he used to attend. Here, he worked alongside volunteers, serving eggs and toast to tired mothers and their children. Each small face reminded him of David, making his heart ache with renewed purpose. "More pancakes, Mr. Grant?" a little girl asked, holding up her plate. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. "Coming right up, sweetheart," he replied, carefully adding 2 warm pancakes to her plate. He'd learned to cook here, among other things. The shelter's kitchen staff had taught him with patient amusement as he burned his first dozen attempts. Between serving meals and washing dishes, Grant listened to stories. He learned about domestic violence, job losses, medical bankruptcies, all the harsh realities he'd once viewed only through spreadsheets and statistics. Now these were people with names and faces, each one precious in God's eyes, as Sister Margaret often reminded him. After his shift ended, he drove to St. Matthew's Church across town. The small prayer group there had become his anchor over the past months. They didn't care about his former wealth or the tabloid stories. They simply made space for him in their circle, teaching him to pray again after years of spiritual silence. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Pastor Mike would say, his weathered face kind. "Sometimes we have to lose everything to find what matters most." Grant spent his afternoons visiting other shelters and outreach programs, always asking about Lila and David while trying to help where he could. He'd learned that throwing money at problems wasn't enough. People needed time, attention, and genuine care. The transformation in him hadn't gone unnoticed. Local news stations had run stories about the billionaire turned volunteer, but the attention felt different now. People approached him not for business deals or photo opportunities, but to share their own stories of loss and redemption. One rainy evening, after serving dinner at St. Catherine's Soup Kitchen, Sister Marie touched his arm. "You remind me of someone," she said thoughtfully. "A lovely woman who volunteers at our sister parish in Jefferson County, makes the most wonderful chicken soup for our homeless friends." Grant's heart skipped a beat. "What's her name?" "Lila," Sister Marie replied. "Quiet thing, always has her young son with her. David, I think his name is. Such a polite boy." The world seemed to stop spinning. Grant gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself. Would you please tell me where to find them?" Sister Marie wrote down an address on a piece of paper. "St. Michael's Church in Golden. They serve breakfast there every Thursday morning." She smiled gently. "You know, she never mentioned you, but that boy, he has your eyes." That night, Grant barely slept. He knelt by his bed for hours, praying for guidance, for forgiveness, for the chance to make things right. The rain beat against his cabin windows, a steady rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Henry arrived before dawn, understanding without words why they needed to leave so early. The 3-hour drive through the rain-soaked mountains felt endless. Grant watched the windshield wipers push away the rain, remembering how David had drawn similar arcs in his notebook during their breakfast at the diner so many months ago. Towns passed in a blur of wet streets and early morning lights. Henry navigated carefully around slick mountain curves, neither of them speaking. The radio stayed silent, no financial reports or news updates, just the sound of rain and tires on wet pavement. Finally, they turned onto a quiet street in Golden. St. Michael's Church stood solid and grey against the cloudy sky, its steeple reaching up like a finger pointing to heaven. The parking lot held only a few cars, their windows fogged in the cool morning air. Grant sat in the car, his hands trembling slightly as he straightened his collar. He'd dressed carefully that morning, not in his old designer clothes, but in clean jeans and a simple blue shirt that Lila had once said brought out his eyes. "Would you like me to go in first, sir?" Henry offered, his voice gentle. Grant shook his head. "No, thank you, Henry. I need to do this myself." He paused, then added, "But thank you for everything, for staying with me through all of this." "Family stays together, sir," Henry replied simply. "And you've been family since your father first hired me 20 years ago." The church steps were slick with rain as Grant climbed them slowly. Each step felt heavy with meaning, with possibility, with fear. The wooden doors creaked softly as he pulled them open, the sound echoing in the quiet morning air. The scent of coffee and something warm, homemade bread, maybe, drifted from the direction of the church kitchen. Grant stood in the entrance, his heart pounding so hard he could barely breathe. Through the doorway, he could see figures moving in the kitchen, hear the quiet clatter of pots and pans. He thought about David's crayon drawing, still carefully preserved in his wallet. One day we'll be together. Perhaps that day had finally come. Or perhaps this was another dead end in his long search. Either way, he knew he had to walk through that door. The rain continued to fall outside, washing the world clean, offering the promise of new beginnings. Grant took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to face whatever waited in that kitchen, ready to complete the journey that had begun with a crumpled letter from a little boy who looked like him. The church kitchen hummed with morning activity. Steam rose from large pots as volunteers prepared breakfast for the homeless community. Lila stood at the industrial stove, her hands steady as she ladled hot chicken soup into bowls. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a faded blue apron over her modest clothes. The heavy kitchen door creaked open, letting in a gust of cool air. Lila looked up, the ladle frozen mid-pour. There stood Grant, his clothes dark with rain, his shoulders trembling slightly. He seemed different, humbler somehow, in his simple jeans and blue shirt. His eyes found hers across the crowded kitchen, filled with a desperate hope that made her heart ache. The room grew eerily quiet. A few volunteers whispered his name in recognition, their voices hushed and wondering. "That's Grant Whitmore," someone murmured. "The billionaire who gave everything up." Lila turned away quickly, but not before Grant caught sight of the tears streaming down her cheeks. She gripped the edge of the steel counter, trying to steady herself. "Lila." Grant's voice was soft, gentle. "Please, I never doubted you. Not for a single moment." He took a step forward, his shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. "Miranda lied. She paid someone to fake those test results. I've been searching for you both for months." Before Lila could respond, rapid footsteps echoed from the hallway. "Daddy came." David's voice rang out with pure joy. He burst through the kitchen door, taller now after these months apart, his face glowing with excitement. Grant dropped to one knee just in time to catch David as the boy launched himself forward. They collided in a tight embrace, David's arms wrapping around his father's neck. "I knew you'd find us!" David exclaimed. "I drew pictures of you every day." Watching them together, Lila's composure crumbled completely. She covered her mouth with her hand, trying to hold back sobs as she realized the truth. Grant wasn't wearing his expensive suits anymore. His designer watch was gone. The news stories she'd avoided reading suddenly made sense. He had sold everything, given up his empire, all to search for them. Grant held David with one arm while reaching into his jacket with his free hand. He pulled out a small, slightly damp envelope. "I have something you need to see," he said to Lila, his voice thick with emotion. "The real DNA test results. I had them done properly, legally. David is my son. He always was." Still holding David close, Grant slowly walked toward Lila. The other volunteers stepped back, creating a respectful space around them. The only sounds were the gentle bubbling of soup pots and the distant patter of rain against the windows. Grant carefully set David down and lowered himself to his knees before Lila. His jeans soaked up water from the floor, but he didn't seem to notice. Looking up at her with tears in his eyes, he spoke from his heart. "I once thought money made me powerful," he said, his voice raw with honesty. "I measured everything in dollars and cents, but love, that's the real fortune. You and David taught me that. You showed me what truly matters." Lila's tears fell freely now. All the anger and hurt she'd carried these past months began to melt away as she looked into his eyes and saw nothing but truth and love there. With a small sob, she finally let go of her pain and collapsed into his embrace. Grant's arms wrapped around her tightly as David joined their hug. They held each other on that kitchen floor, ignoring the whispers and sniffles of touched volunteers around them. They were finally together, not in a mansion or surrounded by luxury, but in a humble church kitchen that smelled of soup and fresh bread. And somehow it felt more like home than any place they'd ever been. The morning light streamed through the windows, catching the tears on their cheeks and turning them to gold. Outside, the rain began to ease, as if nature itself was acknowledging this moment of healing and forgiveness. The small church glowed with warm afternoon sunlight, streaming through its stained glass windows. Simple white flowers and ribbons decorated the wooden pews where townspeople, shelter volunteers, and church staff filled the seats. The humble sanctuary held more love than any grand cathedral could contain. David proudly walked down the aisle in his new navy suit, carefully balancing a white satin pillow that held 2 simple gold rings. His face beamed with pure joy as he took measured steps, just as they'd practiced. When Lila appeared at the church doors in a modest lace dress, Grant's eyes welled with tears. She wore a crown of small white flowers in her hair, and her smile outshone any diamond tiara. As she walked toward him, Grant remembered their journey, from that first letter to this moment of grace. The ceremony was brief but deeply moving. The pastor spoke of redemption and second chances, of how love could build bridges across any divide. When David handed them the rings, his little hands trembling with excitement, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. Afterward, the church hall filled with the sounds of celebration. Folding tables covered in white cloths held home-cooked dishes brought by the community. Children ran between the tables while old hymns played on the piano. The shelter's cook had baked a 3-tiered wedding cake, decorated with fresh flowers that matched Lila's bouquet. During the reception, Grant stood and gently tapped his glass for attention. The room quieted as he took Lila's hand and addressed their guests. Today marks not just our new beginning as a family," he said, his voice warm with purpose, "but the beginning of something bigger. I'm proud to announce David's Hope, a foundation dedicated to funding shelters for single mothers across the country." He smiled at his son, who sat proudly between them. "Lila will manage the foundation, bringing her compassion and wisdom to help others find their way home." The announcement was met with applause and tears of joy. Lila squeezed Grant's hand, knowing their shared mission would help David grow up understanding the true power of kindness and generosity. That evening, they drove home to their mountain house, no longer a showcase of wealth, but a warm family home where prayers were said at bedtime and laughter echoed through the halls. The gardens bloomed again, tended with love rather than hired hands. Light filled every room, not from crystal chandeliers, but from the glow of family photographs and children's artwork hung with pride. The golden red leaves drifted past the windows of the mountain home as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn. Inside, warmth and delicious aromas filled every corner. It was the Whitmores' first Thanksgiving as a family, and the house hummed with activity. In the kitchen, Mrs. Avery moved between pots and pans with practiced grace, her apron dusted with flour. "David, honey, careful with those plates," she called out, watching the boy carry dishes to the dining room with determined concentration. "I've got them, Mrs. Avery," David replied, his tongue peeking out slightly as he focused on his important task. He placed each plate exactly where she had shown him, adjusting the silverware until everything lined up just right. Lila's gentle humming floated through the rooms as she carried in steaming dishes of traditional Thanksgiving fare. The turkey, golden brown and perfectly roasted, took center stage on the table. Around it she arranged bowls of fluffy mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and her special cornbread stuffing. Grant watched from the doorway, his heart full at the sight of his family working together. The house had never felt more alive, more like a true home. When everything was ready, they gathered around the table, joining hands for grace. After the prayer, as they began passing dishes around, Lila caught Grant's eye with a playful smile. "You thought you could hide my son," she teased, echoing the words from his proposal in the garden. Grant's laugh was deep and genuine as he reached for her hand across the table. "Thank God you didn't," he replied softly, his eyes filled with gratitude. Through the glowing windows, the scene was one of perfect contentment. The garden sparkled with the first evening stars, while inside, the warm light illuminated a family brought together, not by wealth or circumstance, but by redemption, unwavering faith, and a love strong enough to heal 3 once-broken hearts into one complete family. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.